So thank you very much for asking me. It's fantastic that so many people have come to this conference from near and far. I thought I'd just, my talk is about sort of breaking through boundaries as in journalism and healthcare. I just want to talk a little bit about getting there. So it's a bit like Henry's talk without repeating too much in terms of the journey, because I think the journey is interesting because every so often, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, I'll get either a final year medical student or a doctor in training coming to me and saying, how do I get to be a broadcaster too? And having that conversation. And when I was, and when you are on this career path, I mean, people say to me, kids say, well, how do I know what I want to be when I grow up? And I usually say, well, I haven't decided yet, so why should you know? And when I was a kid, the decision to do medicine was like a lifetime sentence. And I was intent on becoming an actor. And I used to go, so Glasgow Citizens Theatre was a repertory theatre, and it was known worldwide for its performance, for the way it interpreted Brecht and Ibsen. Brecht, the great German expressionist dramatist, and Ibsen, the Scandinavian playwright. And I used to go by myself. I grew up in a family that wasn't very cultural. I used to go by myself to the theatre in my adolescence. And the Citizens Theatre put on Ibsen's last play, which is, Ibsen at times is an utterly miserable playwright, and his last play was completely miserable, and I don't think it's ever, it doesn't get played very often. And the setting is this aging writer, who must be Ibsen, goes to a mountain resort, and at some point in the action, because you fall asleep during it because it's so miserable, at some point this mysterious figure comes to him to take him on a walk up the mountain. And so a lot of the action in this miserable long play is going up the mountain. And at one point, the Ibsen character says to the mysterious character, why are we going up this mountain? And the character says, for the view when you get to the top. And he said, well, what's the view? What will I see? And he said, well, when you get to the top of this mountain, you will actually have a view of your life. And you will discover that you never lived. At the age of 16, that really did prune my brain quite a lot. And I kind of, when I got into medicine, a good Jewish boy growing up in Glasgow, just imagine wanting to do acting. This was not going to happen. But I did a lot of acting and directing when I was at university. And when I finished medicine and I was going to go on and train literally in psychiatry, then in pediatrics, I remembered this message, and I thought to myself, there could be nothing worse in life than regret, and nothing worse than getting to my 50s and looking back on my life thinking I hadn't done the things I wanted to do. And in fact, Britain was a bit different from Australia, because in Australia, when I got here, I discovered that, in fact, people did stick in medicine. There was not really much deviation from that. Once you were in a medical career, you were. Whereas in Britain, there were actually quite a lot of examples of people who jumped out to become actors, directors, writers, broadcasters, and others. So I'd kind of seen that happening. And my hero is Jonathan Miller, a great director of opera and theatre and comedian as well. And so what I did was, I actually, when I was doing a 1 and 2 roster as a pediatric SHO at a busy London hospital, I actually did an audition for the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. And it won't surprise anybody to hear that I've failed miserably at this. And such was my crisis that I decided to come to the colonies. And that's when I came to Australia as a registrar in paediatrics at what was then called the Royal Alexandra Hospital for Children, now Children's Hospital Westmead as it moved out west in Sydney. But when I came, and I mean, I loved paediatrics, I still love paediatrics, although I don't practice anymore, this dissatisfaction came back. And the amazing thing happened when I came here is that I was on £2,000 a year as an SHO in paediatrics in London, and here I earned quite a lot of money. And I thought, maybe I could actually go part-time and try out other stuff so that when I get to the age of 50, I realized there was other things. So this time I thought I could be a writer. And the Children's Hospital was incredibly patient with me and kept me on as a part-time registrar. And I started doing other things like write. So in those days, looking at the age, you probably, there are things that used to be called typewriters. No screen, just a little piece of paper that goes through. So I had a typewriter, I had a piece of paper, I had carbon behind it, because photocopiers were vanishingly rare in those days. God, I feel old. And I thought I had the great short story, the great film. I had something in me, and nothing happened. That typewriter stayed blank. And eventually I got desperate, because it was getting pretty embarrassing, because all my fellow registrars knew that I'd taken this time off to become famous, and I knew that 2/3 of bugger all were happening on the paper. So I thought I'll start writing about what I knew about, which was health and pediatrics and so on. And I didn't know anything. We've all trained in medicine, and we're all trained that when you don't actually know something, you go back to first principles and you work it out from there. And I didn't know what the first principles were of journalism or writing or anything, and I didn't know anybody in journalism. But I knew there was a scandal, and there was a scandal at the Royal Far West Children's Scheme in Manly. So those of you who come from Sydney might notice that on the beach, there's a thing called the Royal Far West Children's Scheme, which was built to give kids from the bush a holiday by the sea. And then it evolved that when they had to come for care at the Children's Hospital, they could stay by the sea. But in fact, what was happening at the Royal Far West Children's Scheme is they were stealing children. Aboriginal children and poor white children, and not allowing their parents access because they thought they knew better. So that was my first story. I wrote it and it got a government inquiry. So I thought, this is it. My career is set. And I went to see, I wanted to make an appointment to see the editor of the newspaper. It doesn't exist anymore. It was a Sunday paper called the National Times, produced by Fairfax. And I got an appointment to see the editor. He gave me an appointment. I thought that was pretty impressive. Gave me about 3 hours of his time, teaching me about journalism and various other things, and commissioned about 8 articles. And I thought, this was fantastic. And the thing is that you get used to medicine, and although we get frustrated with hospitals and disorganization, how it could all be better, let me tell you, the world of journalism is worse. So I went off and I thought, this is my career made. I was going to write, so I wrote these 8 articles in fast time. I put them in and then didn't hear a word. Nothing happened. What's going on? I kept on phoning, didn't get any answers. And I happened to be at dinner one night, and there was another journalist there, just by accident, because I didn't know any journalists, who worked for the National Times. And I said, what's going on? And he asked me to tell the story. I told him about coming to the office, sitting in this guy's office, big glass office at the top of the room. And he said, you realize he's not the editor. And so Fairfax in those days was this benign organization that didn't like sacking anybody. And they'd sacked this guy as editor, but didn't like to embarrass him, and left him in the editor's chair. And the reason that he could give me 3 hours of his time is that he didn't have anything else to do. And he also didn't have any power to put me in the paper. The real editor, I was told, was this guy called David Marr. And those of you who watch Q&A or The Insiders and read a lot in Australia, David is now extremely well known and a great writer, was the editor. And he thought my stuff was complete shit and never published any of it. I had the great pleasure several years later of employing David when I was running Radio National. And we since kissed and made up. Anyway, I did my tax return at the end of that year, and I'd made $800 from journalism, and I made the correct assumption that the world was not waiting for me. And I made a decision I was going to go back to full-time pediatrics and do respiratory medicine. The very week I was making that decision, I opened the Sydney Morning Herald, and there was an ad for a producer to make science and medical programs for what now is Radio National. I applied for the job, spent a week writing the application, and amazingly got it. And that's where I've been ever since. So that was about early 80s, before most of you were born. And it's just a great feeling to be in a career where it just feels right. It has just the right amount of acting, just the right amount of sort of intellectual challenge, and just, but to be a successful broadcaster more than journalists, but broadcaster journalists, you've got to be a bit of a dilettante. If you like deep dives into stuff, journalism generally isn't for you. Although, because there are only so many positions on 4 corners to be able to do the major investigative pieces. And not much investigative journalism is done these days. But I was lucky I entered the ABC at a time when, in fact, investigative journalism was still funded. I didn't do any health journalism at all for the first 3 or 4 years. I did technology, I was in a science unit, I did social sciences. I actually stepped out for a while. I did a documentary series on Israel and the Zionist idea, which was very controversial. And then I actually started the first current affairs breakfast program on Radio National. And for the 2% of you who actually listen to Radio National, it's now Fran Kelly's program on Radio National, which I sometimes present myself. So I had this great time of doing stuff, and then I started my program, which is called The Health Report, and that's been going on ever since. But when I got into it, it was just so much like being in a hospital, being in the ABC, the sort of public sector organization, which in those days wasn't very well organized. But then you started to realize, as you gain more experience, that you had this immense responsibility as a health journalist to the public. Why was I doing this? So I started off, and the kind of reason for telling this story, the story starts off with ego, that I wanted to be a performer, I wanted to do stuff, and it was all about me. And then when you get into it, if you're actually going to last, that doesn't sustain you, because you become pretty crap at it if that's what it's all about. And what it starts to become about is you start to ask, why are you doing it? And the reason intuitively was that the public's got a right to know what you and I all know. Yeah, we've spent 6 years, 10 years, however long it takes to get where we are, to know what we know. And it's impossible for the layperson to use the categorization that Henry just used to know everything. But I recognize that some of the problems that arise in healthcare are because of what was in this last session in here before afternoon tea, which is about information asymmetry. One of the fundamental problems in healthcare is why is healthcare the most inefficient market in the world? It's the most inefficient market. If you were actually to leave medicine and look at the stock exchange, look at economic theory, whenever there's an inefficient market, two things happen. One is there's a lot of money to be made, and secondly, it's usually because providers have more information than consumers. That's why there are all these regulations about transparency in the stock exchange and so on and so forth. Because when providers know more than consumers, they can make more money, they can exploit them, or even at its most benign, you don't get the best healthcare that you deserve and want. So that's what drove me in terms, and still drives me today, is actually correcting that information asymmetry so that we as doctors get challenged by our patients. We get challenged every day by people who actually don't come in with a ream of stuff off the internet, but we come with the questions that they know need answered. It's one of the most important challenges, I think, in healthcare, and can drive you, in this world of the internet, can drive you completely nuts. Changing subject slightly, there's also the ethical side of medicine. When in my interview for my job, they asked me what big stories did I want to do. It's back in 1981, 82. I said, well, look, let me tell you a story. I'm a new registrar at the Children's Hospital, and I'm talking around my fellow registrars about which terms I should ask for at the Children's Hospital. And they said, look, they're all pretty good terms. I was interested in neonates and respiratory, but they said, what you must not get is the term at Crown Street Women's Hospital. So then those of you who are from Sydney, Crown Street, there used to be a women's hospital in Crown Street. And they said two reasons. One is it's 6 weeks of 1-in-1, so you're dead. And secondly, there's this gynecologist there called William McBride, who's really famous, but you spend your Wednesday evenings ventilating iatrogenically delivered premature babies because he has the highest cesarean section rate, this is what I was told, rate in the hospital, and you've got these babies being delivered at the wrong date. And they said he's famous because he claims to have discovered that thalidomide caused limb abnormalities, and he's become an international superstar because of that. But he didn't, is what I was told. It was actually the nurse on the postnatal ward who discovered it, Sister Sparrow, and he told him that. This is like in my first day working out my thing. So I told my interview committee, I said, there's a story there in Bill McBride. They said, oh, Bill McBride, you can't go after Bill McBride. You know, he's an icon in Australia. I went after Bill McBride because what I discovered was he'd committed a major scientific fraud. very briefly, because I'm running out of time, he made his name out of thalidomide, but he hadn't actually done any research. And it was the sister in the ward who told him. Now, it's not just a terrible story. Why had she told him that it was thalidomide? He was the only one prescribing it, and his babies were the only ones with phocomelia. So she'd made so she'd added it up, but he never accepted that. So he then went off, and because he hadn't done any research, he had to repeat this. And in the early 70s, he tried to repeat this by saying that tricyclic antidepressants cause phocomelia, caused international headlines. The discoverer of thalidomide abnormalities now blames tricyclic antidepressants, which were the only antidepressants depressed mothers could have in those days. And he was actually, when he was held up to an interview on this, he had no evidence whatsoever. And then he went after an anti-nausea drug of pregnancy called Dependox. And he did this one day. He was in a room like this of mothers with babies with phocomelia. Some with thalidomide, some with babies with Poland syndrome. And he said, put up your hand, those of you who took Dependox. And a third of the women put up their hands. So this is what you would fail a first-year medical student at. So he said, there, proof positive that Dependox causes birth abnormalities. When, of course, 30% of all women were taking Dependox. It had been studied in millions of women, and there were no problems with side effects. And he was actually representing himself at trials of the drug company. The drug company took it off the market because they couldn't afford to defend it anymore. And in desperation, he actually got one of his researchers. He had created a research institute to do a research project on a very small number of rabbits, which was inconclusive. And this small experiment with rabbits became a larger experiment with rabbits with manipulated data. And short story long story short, I exposed that, and he was struck off. Because why did I do that? Just to get him down? No, because there were no rules in Australia or many other countries in the world, apart from the United States, about scientific integrity and how you maintain that in the laboratory. And there had already been some cases in Australia, and nobody had done anything. And so as a result of that, the National Health and Medical Research Council and the Australian Research Council actually got together with the universities and created a set of rules and regulations about scientific integrity. I could go on because I could expose another couple of cases of fraud. One amazing one, just 2 minutes, is this psychiatrist gets off the plane from India called Ashok Prasad in Melbourne to work at the Mental Health Research Institute in Melbourne. This is many years ago. But it was after the McBride thing. And the people at the rental thought, this guy's a bullshit artist. He was going on and on how he was the grandson of the president of India. It turns out that that's one of the few things that he was the grandson of the president of India. And he was caught fiddling data on seasonality of birth with schizophrenia, where he'd had to have looked at 16,000 records. There weren't 16,000 records. He had never been in medical records to actually examine them. He escaped the country. He kept on traveling and representing himself in different ways, and including writing false letters about the people who'd exposed him, saying they were drug runners, and amazing stories. One of the most amazing of which was he turns up in Canada, and the person who ran the Mental Health Research Institute gets a copy of a British Columbia newspaper which says, British Columbia psychiatrist nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't know what I've done to deserve such an honor, said Ashok Prasad, psychiatrist. And this guy keeps on turning up. He is a psychiatrist, keeps on turning up with false names, false identities, and created complete havoc. But Australia now has a set of rules and ethical values about scientific integrity, which it didn't have before. So you can make a difference. And I remember somebody saying to me, you can go, one of the frustrations in medicine, and one of the beauties of medicine, if I had to go back to it, I'd not complain at all, but one of the beauties of medicine is that one-to-one relationship between you, a child, the family. There's nothing like pediatrics for that sort of wraparound care and that holistic care. But one of the frustrations is, particularly if you're looking after disadvantaged kids, is what the hell do? I send them back out and they're going to bounce back. I actually don't make these fundamental differences. And for some of us, we're lucky that maybe sometimes you can actually make a difference by taking that population approach and using the tricks of the trade. And the tricks of the trade in journalism are about, and that's where people come astray, is that you've got to play the game. And the game is about emotion. And Henry gave a very emotion-laden talk there, and that's how we learn, you know that. But you've actually got to layer emotion with the evidence. We don't think rationally. We respond to the world in an emotional sense. And good journalism brings emotion, anger, happiness, sadness, whatever, and brings it to the communication of fact. We often fail, but maybe sometimes we succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Norman. Influencing the outcome for patients in different ways, and it's encouraging that there are so many different ways that each of us can influence patient outcomes. So, Jess, do we have anything from the Twitter sphere?
Lots of paraphrasing and re-quoting, but one of the things that really struck a chord was the correction of the informational asymmetry, the comment that you made about that. And I guess sort of teasing a question out of that is, in the role of a journalist, is sometimes that actually selecting information that counters what is being presented in a little bit of a way of selecting chosen, emotive and potentially alternatively biased information to correct to an asymmetry?
Well, people think that there always has to be balance. I actually referred to last night's health report where I had Rob Moody on, who's a major public health figure in Australia. And he was talking about the 7 tactics of unhealthy industries to undermine public health policies. And one of them is the false notion that you need balance. And yes, it's sometimes a problem that you see in journalism, and it's a perceptive comment, which is that you sometimes see a contrary opposite view just to get an edge on it. And so the classic one was last week, with the influenza epidemic here and the serotype not being covered by the vaccine necessarily, and then the anti-vaxxers come out, trying to undermine that. And then people will say, well, shouldn't you be giving equal time to the anti-vaccination lobby? No. There's just some things that there's no balance. The earth is not flat. And you've got to make that call. Well, for surgeons it is, but no, for everybody else it's not.
Every time.
What can you say?
Thank you.
Correcting information asymmetry.
So, thank you for that talk, Henry, and thank you for that closing comment.